Hey there. Tonight, we're going to step into one of the most mysterious and misunderstood roles in ancient history, the life of a palace eunuch in ancient China. Far from just servants, eunuchs were powerful figures who shaped the politics, culture, and daily life of some of the most famous dynasties. But becoming a eunuch wasn't a choice. It was a life-changing and often painful journey, involving castration at a young age and a lifetime of navigating the complex world of the imperial court. In this deep dive, we'll explore what it was really like to live inside the Forbidden City, serving the emperor and his family. You'll discover the daily duties eunuchs performed, the influence they wielded behind the scenes, and the social challenges they faced both inside and outside the palace walls. We'll also look at the myths and realities surrounding castration, the education eunuchs received, and the lasting legacy they left on Chinese history. So get ready to uncover the hidden truths about these unique figures who lived lives of power, sacrifice, loneliness, and intrigue. Tonight, you'll learn why being a palace eunuch was far from simple, and how their stories continue to captivate us today. In ancient China, becoming a palace eunuch was not merely a physical transformation, but a profound reshaping of one's entire identity and future. The process began with the selection of boys, a moment that marked the end of their childhood, as they knew it, and the start of a life bound tightly to the imperial court. These boys were chosen for a variety of reasons. Some were from impoverished families desperate for financial relief. Some were sold or even kidnapped, while others were volunteered by relatives, hoping to secure favor or protection through palace connections. The eunuchs became part of a close-knit community, bound by shared experience. Training covered not only the practical skills needed to serve the emperor and his court, but also instilled a rigid discipline essential for survival in the competitive and often treacherous environment of the imperial household. An influence within the imperial court, sometimes becoming confidants of the emperor or wielding political power behind the scenes. However, this influence came at a price. The physical act of castration was only the beginning of a lifetime shaped by sacrifice and service. Many eunuchs later reflected on the profound loneliness and isolation of their role, as well as the challenges of forging an identity within a system that demanded complete submission and self-control. Yet for some, the palace was also a place of opportunity, a chance to escape poverty, rise through merit, and wield a unique kind of influence unavailable to most in imperial China. Understanding these early years sheds light on the remarkable resilience and complexity of palace eunuchs, whose lives were both marked by loss and defined by a remarkable capacity to adapt and endure. Eunuchs were often mistrusted by officials and nobles, seen as manipulative outsiders who gained their position through proximity to power rather than noble birth or military prowess. Their unique status made them both indispensable and vulnerable as they navigated a complex web of alliances and rivalries. Their lives were defined by a constant balancing act, maintaining loyalty to the emperor while surviving palace intrigues and factionalism. They learned court etiquette, literacy, and the intricate politics of palace life, including how to serve nobles, manage household affairs, and even wield subtle influence. Their education was comprehensive, covering everything from languages and literature to music and calligraphy, because many eunuchs would serve as advisors, scribes, and administrators. Success required intelligence, discretion, and unyielding loyalty. This network provided some emotional support, as boys found solace in companionship with others who had endured similar fates. Eunuchs often had higher voices and less body hair, and some developed distinctive facial features due to hormonal changes. These physical differences made them instantly recognizable within the court and further set them apart from other men. Despite these changes, eunuchs often displayed surprising strength and stamina, a testament to the rigorous physical conditioning many underwent. The health effects were mixed. Some suffered from complications related to their altered bodies, including hormonal imbalances and infections, but others lived long lives, adapting to their unique physiology. However, the psychological scars were deep and complex. Many eunuchs grappled with identity crises, loneliness, and the burden of their enforced celibacy and social ambiguity. Their altered bodies and roles set them apart from typical men and women, placing them in a liminal space that was difficult to navigate emotionally and socially. The decisions to send a child to become a eunuch were often made without fully understanding the lifelong consequences, both for the boy and his family. Once selected, the boy would undergo a rigorous physical examination. Officials were meticulous, searching for health and physical suitability. Any sign of illness or weakness could mean rejection. After the procedure, recovery was a long and precarious journey. Many boys succumbed to blood loss, infection, or shock. Survival was never guaranteed. Those who did survive faced weeks, if not months, of isolation, bandaging, and healing. The emotional toll was equally harrowing. The sudden loss of bodily integrity shattered any naive notions of childhood and introduced feelings of fear, shame, and grief. The boy's sense of self was violently disrupted, no longer simply a child, but marked forever by his altered body and uncertain future. The age range typically favored boys between 8 and 12 years old, a period when their bodies were resilient enough to endure the trauma, yet young enough to adapt physically and psychologically to their new reality. The castration procedure itself was fraught with danger. Performed without anesthetics and under unsanitary conditions, it required extraordinary courage from these young boys. The operation involved the removal of the testicles and often the penis to ensure complete physical emasculation. This irreversible act not only prevented reproduction, but symbolized a permanent severance from the traditional roles of manhood. The physical pain was excruciating. Boys were restrained, often held down by several attendants, while the cuts were made swiftly to minimize prolonged suffering, though the trauma remained intense. Yet, despite this trauma, the imperial palace offered a new form of belonging. Following recovery, these boys entered a strict training regime designed to prepare them for life in the palace. Physically, the absence of testosterone caused many changes that impacted not only appearance, but also health. Socially, eunuchs occupied a paradoxical position. Though formally servants, many rose to positions of significant power. The early years of becoming a eunuch thus encompassed a tumultuous blend of trauma, training, and adaptation. Once inside the towering crimson gates of the imperial palace, your life as a eunuch is no longer your own. From the moment the guards allow you to cross into the inner sanctum of the Forbidden City, the outside world fades like a distant dream. If you are low in the eunuch hierarchy, and nearly everyone is at first, you may be assigned to clean the palace grounds, polish brass ornaments, prepare the robes of minor nobles, or tend to the incense burners that perfume the halls of the empress and her ladies. The lowest ranks may never even glimpse the emperor. They sweep the kitchens, carry messages, or clean the latrines. The food is plain, and you eat quickly rice, pickled vegetables, and sometimes a sliver of meat, always the leftovers of the court. You are expected to be ready at any moment to respond to the call of a bell, the flick of a sleeve, or the sound of a gong. Rumors swirl like incensed smoke. A eunuch accused of stealing a hairpin from a concubine, another caught eavesdropping on a secret meeting, one whispering falsehoods to the empress to gain her favor. You quickly learn that survival depends on discretion and alliances. Quiet paths wind among rock formations and koi ponds, trees bloom in orderly rows, and the scent of peonies drifts on the breeze. You may be sent there to fetch water, deliver a message, or accompany a noble on a stroll. You find moments of quiet connection with others, brief glances of sympathy, small acts of kindness, a shared smile when no one else is watching. You have no family, no future, and no freedom, but you are part of something greater. In the eyes of the world, you are only a eunuch. But in the hush of palace corridors, in the echo of footsteps on stone, in the flicker of candlelight on gold, your presence matters. You learn resilience, patience, and discipline. You find beauty in routine, purpose in service. The Forbidden City is a cage, yes, but it is also a world of its own, ancient and alive, full of secrets, and built on the backs of those like you who give everything to serve. For a moment, the tension eases. But the guards are always nearby, and you cannot speak unless addressed. Nature may surround you, but you are never truly free. You must know who to trust, when to remain silent, and when to speak carefully chosen words in carefully chosen ears. A single rumor could destroy you or raise you to power. Leisure is limited, and privacy does not exist. These relationships offer protection, but they also bind you more tightly to the internal struggles of the palace. You might be sent to deliver messages, report on others, or act as an intermediary in disputes that no noble dares address directly. Your life becomes a dance between obedience and subtle maneuvering. Some eunuchs become legends of the court, rising to positions of immense influence, sometimes even surpassing generals and scholars in the emperor's favor. But even at the top, the fall is never far. The wheel of palace politics turns quickly, and when it turns against you, there is little mercy. Even in the sleeping quarters, where you lie on hard wooden boards beside other eunuchs, there is always a sense of being watched. The palace is not just a workplace. It is a living organism, and you are a cell within it, necessary, but never independent. Your body aches from standing, bowing, and walking, and your mind reels from the unspoken games of the day. Lying in the darkness, you think of the life you left behind, if you even remember it. The village where you were born, the face of your mother, the sound of laughter, these are shadows now. You have become someone else, an instrument of the palace, a vessel for duty, a watcher who must never be seen. Those in the middle serve in more trusted areas, such as the treasury, archives, or private quarters of lesser royals. Only the most experienced and cunning eunuchs reach the upper echelons, those who attend the emperor directly, manage imperial documents, or oversee palace security. These men wield real power, sometimes even more than ministers. But with power comes danger. One misstep, one accusation of theft or overstepping, and you could be beaten or exiled. Sometimes you disappear entirely, a name erased from the scrolls, your robes burned, your story untold. Every task must be completed with perfect obedience and without question. The wrong glance, a too loud footstep, or speaking without permission could end your career or your life. For many eunuchs, especially those who came from poverty, life behind the walls brings a kind of stability. You are fed, clothed, and protected. You walk halls of marble, touch silks from across the empire, and witness the workings of the imperial machine. There is awe in serving the emperor, in participating, however indirectly, in rituals that have existed for centuries. Some eunuchs take great pride in mastering the art of court behavior. They learn to read the unspoken language of glances, bows, silences, and posture. They memorize the names of consorts and ministers, the proper protocol for each interaction, and even the subtle politics that govern the palace's quieter intrigues. Inside this gilded cage, the danger is not in weapons, but in etiquette and perception. A misplaced gesture is as lethal as a dagger. You are now a part of something vast and unchanging, where tradition, ceremony, and hierarchy rule every breath you take. The palace itself is overwhelming in its scale and silence. Its wide courtyards are surrounded by majestic halls with golden roofs, and everywhere you turn, there are eyes watchful officials, fellow eunuchs, silent guards, and even the stone lions that seem to glare at you with suspicion. Nothing belongs to you, not your name, not your past, and certainly not your time. You rise when the bell sounds before dawn, long before the emperor stirs, and your daily existence is tightly woven into the rituals that uphold the celestial order of the Chinese court. Your day begins with service, not to yourself, but to someone higher in rank. Palace eunuchs are everywhere and yet invisible. You might walk past rows of imperial concubines and be expected not to lift your gaze. You hear the shuffling silk of royal garments, the murmur of the emperor's advisors behind lacquered screens, and you must keep walking as though you hear nothing. As the emperor's shadow moves through the corridors, accompanied by court musicians and perfumed nobles, you lower your head and freeze, offering the proper bow without being told. Every movement is measured, every breath controlled. The palace runs on a strict hierarchy, and eunuchs are categorized accordingly. Meals are taken quickly and silently, usually in secluded kitchens set aside for servants. You are not allowed to dine near the nobles. Despite this, life in the palace also offers what the outside world cannot, and there are intrigues. The palace is not all reverence and routine. It is also a battlefield of quiet ambition. Eunuchs rise and fall in favor. If you serve long enough and avoid missteps, you may eventually gain a patron perhaps, a prince, a dowager empress, or an aging minister who finds your loyalty useful. Beyond the palace buildings, the gardens offer a strange contrast. At night, when the last of the lamps are extinguished and the halls fall into deep shadow, you return to your quarters exhausted. Yet, within this life of ritual and restraint, there is something deeply human. And so, you continue, day after day, step after step, within walls that never change. In the grand hierarchy of imperial China, where every robe, gesture, and word was laced with meaning, few figures moved as fluidly and as dangerously between the ranks of power as the eunuch. At first, you are merely a servant. You carry messages, sweep the halls, prepare the imperial robes, and light the incense in the empress's quarters. You escort concubines to private audiences. You prepare the ritual spaces before major ceremonies. You are summoned not just to serve tea, but to remain in the room during intimate conversations. The emperor may grow used to your presence, may even speak freely around you. Even if you never speak above a whisper, others notice. Ministers begin to nod in your direction. Concubines ask you for favors. Princes eye you with suspicion. You, the man who has no family and no heirs, become the thread that weaves together the inner court. Unlike most men, you can enter her private quarters without suspicion. You dress her, assist her, comfort her when she is unwell. And if she trusts you, truly trusts you, you may become her voice. Power earned through service can be taken away in a moment. Because despite the risk, someone must serve the inner court. You walk the fine line between obedience and manipulation. You gather knowledge not to hoard, but to survive. You influence the empire not with armies or decrees, but with timing, tact, and trust. You are not celebrated in public. You do not wear silks of rank. But in the shadows behind the throne, where real power whispers and watches, you are essential. Someone must tend to the emperor's most private needs, soothe the empress's fears, manage the complex web of relationships that bind the palace together, and that someone can only be you. You, who cannot be corrupted by family ambition. You, who is always near but never in the way. You, who can listen without speaking, act without being seen. The death of an emperor can leave you exposed to enemies. A new ruler may view you with suspicion. A single accusation of bribery, betrayal, or conspiracy can end your life. You may be arrested without trial, your possessions seized, your name struck from the records. No matter how powerful, a eunuch is always vulnerable, always disposable. The very thing that allowed you to rise your closeness to power also ensures that you are never truly secure. You deliver messages to ministers. You carry gifts to favored concubines. You quietly remove enemies from her presence by citing violations of protocol. To the outside world, the empress is untouchable. But to you, She is real smiling, weeping, sometimes terrified. And you, for all your limitations, have the power to soothe or destroy her with the truths you carry. You are a courier of knowledge, a keeper of secrets. When an emperor is young or ill, when ministers quarrel, or when factions within the court erupt, eunuchs become stabilizers. One may build a private library rivaling the emperor's own. Another may oversee vast naval voyages or lead imperial armies, trusted above even the generals. A few may even manipulate succession, guiding the emperor's choice of heir in whispered conversations behind closed doors. For these eunuchs, power is not a possibility. It is a reality. And though their ascent may be viewed with disdain by scholars, no one can deny their cunning. You deliver the decree that appoints a new regent. You hold the seal that verifies an order. You decide who gets access to the emperor's ear and who waits in vain. You might be blamed for overreach, and sometimes justly so. But you might also be the only reason a palace doesn't collapse under its own weight. And knowledge, in a palace where a wrong word can collapse a career, is the greatest weapon of all. He might ask your opinion, not because he values it, but because you are the only one near when a thought crosses his mind. They relay honest reports, warn of treachery, advise with prudence. But others driven by ambition, fear, or the taste of influence become players in the game. Yet none of them can deny your influence. Some emperors depend on you so thoroughly that they cease to make decisions without your guidance. Others try to suppress your growing power, only to find that their own wives, sons, and servants are already loyal to you. You, who sleep in plain robes and eat in silence, become the gatekeeper to the most powerful man in the world. They manipulate conversations, hide letters, forge alliances. They whisper half-truths in the empress's ear, then deny it to the emperor. They redirect funds, make appointments, delay or accelerate punishments. And because they have no family, no dynasty to threaten the throne, their presence is tolerated, sometimes even trusted more than any nobleman or general. If you are careful, if you answer with caution and humility, you may become his echo, his memory, his quiet advisor. You handle confidential letters, sometimes sealed with wax, other times written in the flowing, delicate calligraphy of a noble hand. Each message tells you something not just in words, but in tone, urgency, and timing. You begin to understand the rhythms of the court, which ministers argue in secret, which concubines have fallen from favor, which rumors are safe to repeat, and which will cost you your position. These tasks seem mundane, but they are never casual. Each one is a lesson in discipline. Every bow, every step, every whispered response must be exact. Mistakes are noted. Silence is expected. Obedience is rewarded, but only just enough to keep you striving. You learn to listen more than you speak. You learn that attention to detail, how long someone lingers in a room, who shares glances with whom, what time someone retires, can be more valuable than anything said aloud. Though physically altered and socially branded by their castration, eunuchs occupied a space unlike any other, neither noble nor common, yet capable of wielding enormous influence. You, as a eunuch, are caught in this paradox. You are expected to be silent and invisible, a perfect servant who neither thinks nor wants. Yet the very closeness you maintain to emperors, empresses, concubines, and ministers allows you access to the deepest secrets of the realm. It is this contradiction, humble in form, essential in function, that defines your life. And it is through this very role that you begin to learn the palace's most important rule. Power does not always lie in the throne, but in the shadows beside it. From the moment you are inducted into the imperial household, your duties are clear. As you rise through the ranks, your responsibilities deepen. You are no longer simply a servant. You are a facilitator. And then, if fortune or calculation favors you, you may become something more, a confidant. That is when things become dangerous. With proximity comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes power. Some eunuchs remain loyal, using their position to protect the emperor's interests. This is why eunuchs are both feared and resented. The court whispers about you behind silk fans. Scholars scoff at your illiteracy. Generals mock your inability to bear arms. The empress too may rely on you. In times of political instability, eunuchs often rise further still. Some eunuchs become legendary. Their names, once meaningless, become etched in the chronicles of dynasties. But the higher you climb, the farther you can fall. Still, the role of the eunuch persists across centuries, across dynasties. And so, your life is lived in a careful balance. Servant, spy, and advisor all at once. That is the role of the eunuch. And once you understand it, you never see the palace the same way again. There are stories that drift through the corridors of the Forbidden City, long after the people who live them are gone. They settle in the corners of ceremonial halls and hover behind brocaded screens, half whispered by scholars and servants alike. And many of these stories, surprisingly or perhaps inevitably, center on eunuchs. You may have thought yourself alone in the world when you first stepped into the palace, small, shaven, voiceless. Nowhere is this more evident than in the life of Wei Zhongshan. His rise was meteoric. Once an obscure servant, he aligned himself with the future Tuanxi emperor when the prince was still uncertain and isolated. When that prince took the throne, Wei Zhongshan became not just a chamberlain, but the de facto ruler of the empire. He appointed ministers, dictated policies, and punished dissent with chilling efficiency. He promoted members of his own faction and silenced Confucian scholars who dared question his authority. Fathers mistrusted heirs, mothers favored other children, and dynastic succession was never as straightforward as it seemed. During the reign of Empress Dowager Cixi, it was not uncommon for eunuchs to act as intermediaries between the empress and the outside world. She trusted her attendants more than many ministers. One such eunuch, Li Lianying, began his service in the kitchens. But with patience, loyalty, and honoring attention to the moods of the empress, he became her closest confidant. Ministers may rally against you. Princes may accuse you of meddling. Scholars may publish scathing condemnations of your class. You have no clan to protect you, no ancestral name to soften your fall. When a general lowers his voice in your presence, when a young prince looks to you for reassurance before taking his seat beside the dragon throne. But you know the truth. You were there, behind the curtain, behind the throne. Your hand steadied the empire, even if it never signed a single edict. Your eyes saw more than any official account could capture. Your loyalty strategic or sincere held dynasties together when bloodlines alone could not. You have become, like those before you, the invisible engine of the imperial machine. You know how to pull its levers gently, how to say just enough, never too much. You can remove a rival not with poison, but with a word placed in the right ear. You can protect a friend not with swords, but by delaying a message. It is not magic. It is mastery. If you are purged, you vanish. If your name is erased from the records, it is as if you never existed. That is the true price of power for someone like you. It is real, but it is never secure. He influenced appointments, managed her correspondence, and acted as her gatekeeper. While scholars scorned him as uneducated, and generals grumbled at his arrogance, no one could deny that Li Lianying controlled access to the most powerful woman in China. His whisper carried more weight than a nobleman's shout. In such moments, eunuchs became arbiters. Who else had been in the palace long enough to know every concubine, every whisper, every bribe and betrayal? You hear them in the cautious words of older eunuchs who remember who fell and who thrived. You read them in the eyes of ministers who glare at you but cannot ignore you. You feel them in your own heart as you accept more responsibility than you ever imagined, standing not at the center of attention, but just beside it where influence lives. Who else had no personal stake in the outcome? No family name to elevate, no children to benefit. You might be asked to deliver the imperial seal. You might be asked to lie, to forge a document, to support a child emperor over a rebellious older brother. These decisions are not made with comfort. They are made with calculation. Some said he ruled more absolutely than the emperor himself. His portrait hung in temples. His name was feared in households across the capital. But in truth, you are part of a legacy of men who, without families or futures of their own, carved out empires behind the veil of ceremony. With the death of the Tensai emperor, Wei's enemies moved swiftly. You, walking the same stone corridors as they once did, cannot help but feel both awe and dread. The path to power exists for you, but it is a tightrope. A misstep is fatal. A smile too wide, a bow too slow, a favor granted to the wrong minister, and the entire palace turns on you. You've seen it happen. Eunuchs who flew too close to the sun, burned by the very light they sought. He was stripped of his titles, and sensing his imminent execution, he hanged himself. His body was exhumed and dismembered by enraged officials. Statues of him were torn down. His legacy was officially condemned. When they were weak, they relied on them completely. The Wanli emperor of the Ming era grew weary of court politics and retreated into seclusion. He refused to attend meetings, ignored memorials, and let his ministers fume in frustration. Who, then, managed the empire's daily operations? Who relayed decrees, handled correspondence, soothed fractious nobles, and maintained a semblance of control? It was the eunuchs, moving silently through the bureaucracy, steadying the ship while the captain slept. And yet, in private, some still muttered with grudging respect. No one had ever held the court so completely without wearing a crown. This is the story of power behind the throne, the quiet, calculating, and sometimes catastrophic influence wielded by eunuchs who learned to turn service into sovereignty. It is whispered that Zheng He, born Ma He in the late 14th century, was captured as a boy and castrated before becoming a servant in the court of the Yongle emperor. But he would not remain a mere attendant. No, Zheng He would rise to become admiral of the imperial fleet, commanding treasure ships larger than any wooden vessels the world had seen. While others debated policy within the capital, Zheng He charted new territories, bringing tribute, diplomacy, and imperial presence across Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. He was no mere navigator. He was the arm of the emperor, stretching across oceans. His voyages projected not just might, but control, a message to the world that China's emperor needed no armies to assert his will, only a eunuch with a compass and a cause. Then there was Gao Lian, a lesser-known but no less significant figure in the court of the Song dynasty. Gao Lian began his life in humble service, but through cunning alliances and strategic loyalty, he became one of the emperor's most trusted advisors. When a military rebellion threatened the capital, it was Gao Lian who arranged the defense, negotiated with hostile factions, and orchestrated a series of administrative reforms that restored peace quietly, efficiently, and with minimal bloodshed. Ministers grumbled that a eunuch held too much sway over military affairs, but the emperor responded simply, "He saved the throne." And that was enough. The Ming dynasty, with its rigid structures and obsession with protocol, proved both a fertile and dangerous time for eunuchs. But his reign was also a cautionary tale. Stories like his ripple through time, not just as historical accounts, but as warnings and possibilities. And yet, the allure remains. Even when emperors were strong, they leaned on their eunuchs. Sometimes, emperors even chose eunuchs over their own sons. The Qing dynasty, inheriting both the glories and failings of its predecessors, also witnessed the quiet expansion of eunuch power. These stories, though rare, are not fantasy. They are echoes. But you must also be wary. For every eunuch who rose, another was cut down. accused of overreach, blamed for imperial decline, targeted by reformists, and always expendable. And yet, even knowing all this, you cannot turn away. You understand the weight of your influence when an Empress Dowager nods to you in the middle of a ceremony, her command unspoken but understood. So when the court historians later write of your time, they may speak only of the emperors and their decrees. You were a eunuch, and sometimes that meant you were the most powerful man in China. Outside the towering red walls of the palace, the world was a different place for a eunuch. The grandeur and hierarchy of the court disappeared the moment you stepped beyond its gates, and what remained was a deep chasm between who you were and how you were seen. This wasn't just about physical castration. It was about identity, about masculinity, about one's place in a tightly structured Confucian world that emphasized family, lineage, and patriarchal duty. To be a man who could never father children or carry on the family name was to be seen as someone broken, or worse, deliberately unclean. For them, becoming a eunuch was less a choice than a sacrifice made on behalf of survival. A eunuch could control access to the emperor, approve royal decrees, or manage the flow of goods through the Forbidden City. But respect in the palace did not buy acceptance on the streets. Power was temporary, conditional. Eunuchs were not supposed to marry, though some were permitted to adopt sons later in life. Many tried to fill the void with religion or philosophy. A select few built temples, sponsored charities, or established family lines through adoption. But even then, whispers followed them. People questioned how they obtained their riches, suspected them of corruption, or refused to let go of old superstitions. The title of eunuch was not one you ever really escaped. It clung to you in death as much as in life. Was the prestige of court life, the power, the rare moments of influence enough to make up for the isolation, the loss of identity, and the enduring social judgment? Of walking through a world that saw you not as a person, but as a symbol of sacrifice, of mystery, of something not quite whole. And yet, within that broken image, there was often extraordinary strength, the endurance to live a life of contradiction, and the grace to carry silence where others carried pride. Every eunuch must have wrestled with that in the quiet moments, at night, after the candles were out, when no one was watching. Some turned to Buddhism, which offered a kind of peace and detachment, a way to think beyond the confines of the physical body. For eunuchs who had spent their entire lives in the palace, there was often no place to return to. Many had been taken from their families as young boys, and few kept connections beyond the court. When retirement came, or when political tides shifted, you might find yourself cast out from the only home you had ever known. Without a role, without family, and without a community, some fell into poverty or despair. Others lived in small eunuch communities near temple complexes, trying to live out their days quietly, often forgotten. Others poured themselves into their work, finding identity in perfect routines, meticulous rituals, or loyal service. In service, you were everywhere, attending the emperor, guiding ceremonies, managing affairs. But in solitude, you became invisible. Your years of loyalty didn't guarantee remembrance. Your sacrifices were not always honored, and yet some eunuchs found solace in the life they led. They believed their suffering was part of something larger, a service to the empire, a life of higher calling, a path to spiritual purity. But even in these acts, there lingered a quiet yearning for companionship, for acceptance, for a life that might have been. But true companionship was hard to come by. Friendships with fellow eunuchs could be dangerous if they bred suspicion among superiors. Love, in the romantic sense, was nearly impossible. Some eunuchs did form close bonds with concubines, fellow servants, or even nobles, but these relationships were often tinged with risk. Any suggestion of impropriety, however baseless, could bring ruin. The palace was a place of secrets, and secrets were deadly. The moment your influence waned, or you were cast out from the court society, would quickly remind you of what you truly were in their eyes: incomplete, suspicious, and alone. Yet that didn't soften the way the outside world viewed them. In the Forbidden City, eunuchs were housed in separate quarters. They had their own dining halls, their own gardens, their own dormitories. At first glance, this separation might have looked like privilege, a kind of cloistered, comfortable existence. But the walls that kept others out also kept the eunuchs in. For many, it felt like a life under quiet imprisonment. You could serve for decades and still remain a stranger to the world outside. If anything, it added another layer of tragedy. You were seen as pitiable at best, contemptible at worst. Common folk sometimes regarded eunuchs as eerie or unnatural men who had stepped too far from the path of normal life. Superstitions even circulated that eunuchs brought bad luck, or that their condition could be spiritually contagious, a corruption of balance in the cosmic order. For many ordinary people in ancient China, a eunuch wasn't just a curiosity, he was a living contradiction. Inside the palace, a eunuch might be respected, even feared, depending on his rank and influence. Confucian values placed immense importance on filial piety devotion to one, his parents and ancestors, which included the sacred duty of continuing the family line. To voluntarily give up that responsibility, even for the emperor, was seen as a betrayal of that obligation. Some families considered having a eunuch in their lineage to be shameful, even if it meant access to wealth and influence. The act of castration, no matter how prestigious the outcome, was a stain that could never be washed away. But beyond those walls, you were something else entirely, something many people did not quite know how to talk about. In society's eyes, a eunuch was a man who had given up the very thing that made him a man. This social stigma had roots that stretched far back into the culture. Because of this, many eunuchs were orphans or children from extremely poor families. And yet, the contradiction persisted. The same people who whispered curses about eunuchs in the streets might also find themselves bowing to one at court. This sense of isolation went far beyond social prejudice. It lived in the very architecture of a eunuch's life. Personal relationships were rare and often discouraged. Even when a eunuch was powerful, the emotional toll of isolation ran deep. Occasionally, a eunuch might rise high enough to win favor with the emperor and retire in wealth. The loneliness became most pronounced in old age. There's a haunting stillness to this part of a eunuch's story. Still, the question lingers. Was it worth it? The story of the palace eunuch is not simply one of power or service. It's also a story of invisibility. You were surrounded by opulence, but it never filled the empty corners of your heart. Inside the Forbidden City, life moved with the rhythm of ritual and duty. You were a paradox. On one hand, the palace relied on you. It entrusted you with secrets, keys, rituals, and lives. You would have arrived too young to fully understand what was being taken from you. Not just your physicality, but your future. There would be no wife, no children, no family to call your own. Many assumed that without the body of a man, you had no hunger, no longing, but emotions do not live in flesh alone. You could still feel tenderness, still ache for connection. You might watch the empress from a distance, or see the younger palace maids pass by with their bound feet and their downcast eyes, and feel something stir, not always lust, but perhaps a yearning to be seen, to be touched, to be known. Your identity was to be tethered to the court, and your status would always be defined by what had been cut away. These moments were quietly observed. There were no children to mourn them, no wives to weep. Just a small ceremony, a few words, and perhaps a flicker of sadness among those still living. You might feel a strange echo of your own future in those moments, a life passing unnoticed, except by the few who shared your burden. The chance to be loved without suspicion, the chance to belong without condition, the chance to be seen not as a tool, but as a person. Some were caught sneaking into the servants' quarters at night and faced brutal punishment. They mentored younger servants. They built quiet legacies of kindness or wisdom. Feelings were a liability, and love, in any form, was often seen as a threat to control. Over time, you might have learned to numb yourself, to bury your longing under layers of duty. Not just endured, but thrived in their own way. They built communities of care within the margins, found meaning in loyalty and strength in survival. Their lives, though shaped by sacrifice, were far from empty. In the palace's long, silent corridors, their footsteps echo still, but it never truly left. It was there in the quiet, in the stolen glances, in the ache that woke you in the middle of the night. Some managed to purchase property or sponsor temples after retirement. A few even adopted heirs from distant relatives. In rare cases, a eunuch's name would be remembered, not because of power or proximity to the throne, but because of the compassion they showed behind closed doors. A hand held too long, a letter exchanged, a glance that lingered. These were small rebellions against the machinery of palace life, and they offered a fragile hope in a world designed to suppress it. Others were accused falsely, and the accusation alone was enough to destroy them. And the lanterns dimmed, you would return to your quarters, shared yet isolating. You lived in service of others, your name rarely recorded, your story often forgotten. And yet, in rare moments of reflection, you might have taken pride in what you endured. To survive in the palace, to rise even, required cunning, discipline, and strength. Even if the world saw you as less than whole, you knew what you had sacrificed, and what it had cost you to keep going. You would lie on a stiff mat, stare at the ceiling, and listen to the distant sounds of the city you rarely saw. Perhaps you would wonder what your life might have been had you stayed in your village. Would you have become a farmer, a father, a husband? Would you have known the joy of hearing a child call you father, or the comfort of aging beside someone who loved you? The irony was painful. You had been physically altered precisely, so you would be safe in the women's quarters. Yet even the suggestion of impropriety could condemn you. This sense of difference began early and deepened with time. On the other, society viewed you with suspicion, even disgust. You were not a man in the traditional sense, and in a culture that so deeply valued lineage, masculinity, and filial piety that made you an object of pity or ridicule. But in the silent spaces between appointments and ceremonies, in the long corridors where you passed others without a word, you felt the weight of solitude settle over your shoulders like the heavy robes you wore. You served emperors, empresses, princes, and high officials. In the private corners of dormitories, during shared duties or stolen moments in garden courtyards, bonds could form. You would talk in hushed tones, maybe share food, or recount memories of a home you barely remembered. You might laugh, even if quietly, even if only for a moment. But you always knew there were lines that could not be crossed. True vulnerability was dangerous. Trusting the wrong person could mean ruin. A whispered rumor could lead to demotion, punishment, or worse. You lived at the center of one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. And yet, at times, you felt like a ghost, present, necessary, and yet strangely invisible. To be a eunuch was to be neither fully accepted nor fully rejected. Companionship in any form was complicated. Most eunuchs entered the palace as boys. You might have found comfort in friendship, and indeed, some did. Desire did not disappear with your surgery. That was one of the more tragic misconceptions. But such feelings were dangerous. Eunuchs were forbidden from having romantic or sexual relationships. Some eunuchs turned to each other for solace. Quiet, hidden relationships may have formed, perhaps not always physical, but deeply emotional. But for many, loneliness was the constant companion. After a long day of service, when the halls quieted, instead, your loyalty was to the court, your legacy buried beneath ceremony and shadow. Occasionally, a fellow eunuch might fall ill or pass away. And yet, some eunuchs did find ways to leave a mark. Still, the palace was not a place of emotional abundance. It was a world of protocol, precision, and politics. In the end, the greatest tragedy of the eunuch's life was not just what was taken, but what was never given. And yet, despite it all, many endured. You arrived at the palace unsure of what you would become. You were still young, small, perhaps barely more than a child. You were not simply to serve. You were to be reshaped, retrained, refined into a perfect extension of the palace itself. You had to become invisible and indispensable at the same time. And to do that, you would need to learn everything. You studied the rules of court behavior like scripture. How to address a concubine of the third rank. When to speak. When to remain silent. Many eunuchs were uneducated when they arrived, but the court demanded more. If you showed skill, you might be sent to a special office to copy documents, track palace inventory, or even transcribe the imperial diary. But you had to be more than a scribe. You had to understand diplomacy, internal court politics, and the ancient classics. So you read Confucius, memorized verses, and studied the rites that governed the palace for centuries. Not because anyone believed you should be wise, but because you had to seem wise enough to assist someone who was. You learned characters day after day, practicing on tablets with brushes until your writing was neat and respectful. You practiced with staves, spears, and bare hands. You learned pressure points, restraint techniques, and how to disable someone twice your size. If you proved intelligent and loyal, you might be assigned to high offices, the Directorate of Ceremonial, the Inner Treasury, or the secretive Office of Palace Communications. Here, your education became administrative. You learned how to draft decrees, audit palace expenses, oversee shipments of tribute. You became a bureaucrat in silk robes, moving papers that could shape lives. You could quote poetry, settle disputes, manage an entire wing of the palace. And for those who rose far, those who advised emperors, directed palace operations, or whispered policy into the ears of queens, it was the foundation of everything. Behind every order you carried, behind every scroll you held, was the quiet discipline of years of study. Perhaps you allowed yourself a quiet thought. I may not have chosen this life, but I mastered it. And that mastery, not the title, not the robes, not even the emperor's favor, was yours, and yours alone. You were unarmed, yet dangerous, powerless, yet feared. And when others looked down on you, you met their gaze with a calm that said, I know something you don't. You were taught not just how to strike, but when not to. Your training molded your posture, your thoughts, even your voice. Some opened private schools. Some wrote memoirs, dictated to scribes. Others taught the next generation of eunuchs, shaping them not with bitterness, but with precision and care. It was your way of surviving, of ensuring that even if your name was forgotten, your training lived on in others. You were taught not to shout, not to question, not to dream. Everything was aimed at loyalty, precision, obedience. You were not meant to become someone. You were meant to disappear into function. The more perfectly you played your role, the less anyone would notice the human behind it. How to restrain without bruising. How to stand like a shadow and vanish just as easily. You were not a soldier, but you had to be strong enough to protect the Empress from a sudden threat, and silent enough to stop an assassin before they crossed a threshold. In the palace, a raised voice might carry, a footstep might echo, a cough might mean someone was eavesdropping. You were taught to recognize symptoms, apply ointments, administer powders, and brew delicate teas that soothed or sedated. You carried the remedies of the imperial household in your sleeves, and had to know which ones could cure, and which ones could kill. You couldn't write it all down, not where someone might find it, so you stored it in your mind like a locked cabinet. In a world that discarded you, the palace made you necessary. It gave you knowledge, influence, even elegance. You became fluent in the language of power, even if you never got to wield it fully. You knew how to speak to a duke, how to correct a mistake without causing offense, how to bow so deeply it seemed sincere, even when it wasn't. A good eunuch was a living archive. A great eunuch never forgot a face or a favor. So you learned to hear everything and say nothing. You listened for the shift in tone that meant trouble. You learned how to read between words, how to sense when a servant was lying or when a court lady's tears were for show. You might play a female part, not just because of your physical condition, but because of your training, the grace, the stillness, the ability to inhabit a character completely. And perhaps in those moments, under layers of silk and face paint, you felt freer than you ever had. Or perhaps it deepened the confusion of who you were and who you were allowed to be. Literacy opened doors. It meant you could serve in the archives, deliver confidential notes, assist in compiling the emperor's poetry. It meant trust. What gifts could be given to whom, and what colors you must never wear in the presence of the imperial family. The palace was full of music, for ceremonies, feasts, rituals, and private performances. Eunuchs were often required to play instruments, to sing, or even to dance. Not for applause, but to maintain harmony and elegance in the court. You might have learned the pipa, or the guqin, with its gentle, melancholy notes. You practiced in silence, in the cold early hours before sunrise, until your fingers knew the melodies better than your tongue knew your own name. One mistake could mean a slap, or worse, a transfer to the kitchens, or the night shift scrubbing latrines. So you memorized everything, down to the position of your fingers when pouring tea. The long halls of the Forbidden City swallowed you whole. The first thing they taught you was how to carry yourself. You learned to walk quietly, to keep your eyes down, to move with grace, even when your feet ached. You were told never to turn your back on the emperor or empress, to bow at the correct angle, and to hold your hands just so. You practiced these motions over and over until they became muscle memory. Perfection was not praised. It was expected. At first, all you understood was that you are no longer who you were before. Your village name meant nothing here. Your past life had ended quietly, and this new one began in silence, cloaked in incense, ritual, and endless waiting. What awaited you was not just obedience, but transformation. Your training began the very next day. It was not violent, not loud, but it was relentless. Then came etiquette. You were also taught how to read, a rare privilege. Some eunuchs rose in rank because of their writing alone. You were also taught how to listen. Truly listen. You practiced memory exercises. The names of every official, concubine, and attendant. Their ranks, their preferences, their enemies. And then, curiously, came music. Some eunuchs served in the imperial opera, playing roles that men of the outside world would never dare attempt. Martial training was not universal, but it existed. Some eunuchs were assigned to assist in palace security or guard precious chambers. These eunuchs learned how to fight. There was also instruction in medicine and herbal knowledge. Many eunuchs worked in the inner quarters, where doctors were not always allowed. Some eunuchs went even further. But education in the palace wasn't just about skills. It was about control. And yet, for some, that education was a source of pride. Over time, your training changed you. The boy who arrived in silence became a man who moved without fear. Education was your armor. It protected you when your status could not. And when you finally retired, if you were lucky enough to live that long, the knowledge stayed with you. In the stillness of the palace at night, when the ceremonial bells had stopped ringing and the last servant had bowed out, in the quiet stillness of the palace corridors, the eunuch walked lightly, his steps muted by silk slippers and time. The marble beneath his feet had been worn smooth by centuries of service. Castration was not a symbolic gesture. It was complete removal of the external genitalia, typically performed on boys between the ages of 6 and 12. The process was brutal and dangerous. Without anesthesia, antibiotics, or surgical standards, the operation was conducted swiftly, often by someone with only basic knowledge. The pain was unimaginable. While emperors had access to elite care, eunuchs, despite their proximity to power, were often treated with indifference. This was especially true in later dynasties, when diet improved and palace living offered shelter from war, famine, and disease. Without the usual structure and muscle tone of the urethra, many eunuchs struggled to urinate properly. The emotional toll of being castrated as a child removed from family, stripped of identity, and shaped to serve was profound. In a world where peasants starved and soldiers died young, the palace offered shelter. A eunuch who served well might receive decent food, warm clothing, and occasional gifts. He might be entrusted with valuable tasks, even rise in the hierarchy. They were windows into the cost of obedience, the biology of submission, and the quiet endurance of a body reshaped by power. In the end, the palace gave as much as it took. It offered safety, prestige, and routine, but demanded blood, silence, and a reshaping of the soul. The eunuch's life was long for some, short for others, but always marked by the body that bore the empire's deepest scars. Some became heads of departments, overseers of imperial treasures, or stewards of private affairs. These men still bore the scars of their past, but they found purpose, and in some cases, pride in their roles. The body may have suffered, but the mind could find meaning. Many eunuchs experienced depression, especially those who served in lower roles with little prestige. Without children or kin, elderly eunuchs relied on the goodwill of the court. Some retired to special eunuch quarters, where they lived out their final years among others like themselves. These were quiet places, filled with soft conversation and the sound of wind through pines. Others remained at their posts until they could no longer walk. When death approached, they were often buried in designated eunuch cemeteries, far from the ancestral tombs of ordinary men. Some tombstones bore titles, honors, or poetry. Others bore nothing but a name. Without families of their own, and often without meaningful friendships, they drifted through decades of quiet labor. These men had risen high, often becoming confidants of emperors or empresses. Their funerals were quiet affairs, conducted at dusk with incense and silence. They were remembered not as men, nor quite as martyrs, but as loyal tools of the throne. And in death, as in life, their bodies were reminders of sacrifice shaped, altered, and claimed by the empire. Loneliness was a constant ache, dulled only by routine or distraction. Some turned to writing, calligraphy, or gardening as forms of self-expression. Others quietly resigned themselves to silence. Very few ever spoke of the life they might have lived. This could lead to bladder infections, kidney stones, or chronic inflammation. Others suffered from poor digestion, possibly due to low muscle tone and lack of physical activity. Joint pain, headaches, and a mysterious fatigue plagued many in middle age. Still, these symptoms were rarely discussed. In the palace, appearances mattered more than health. A eunuch who limped or coughed too often might be reassigned, demoted, or simply forgotten. It is even recorded that certain eunuchs lived well into their 80s or 90s, an astonishing feat in ancient times. Some historians speculate that the absence of testosterone reduced their risk of prostate cancer or heart disease. Others point to the stability and safety of palace life as a factor. But not all eunuchs were so fortunate. Many died young, worn down by illness, isolation, or overwork. The average eunuch did not live a long life. Those who did were the exception, not the rule. They were not family, nor truly men, and their suffering was seen as part of their sacrifice. The imperial court employed herbalists and acupuncturists, and many eunuchs sought their help, especially for pain or digestive issues. But few treatments address the root cause: hormonal imbalance, emotional stress, and the trauma embedded in their very identities. A single slip of the blade could mean death from blood loss or infection. Many died on the table or in the days that followed. For those who lived, scarring, incontinence, and internal complications were frequent and lifelong burdens. A eunuch's entrance into palace life was often stained with blood, suffering, and the silent horror of a body changed forever. And his body, though aged before its years, bore the marks of a life lived in devotion to the court. Yet beneath the embroidered robes, behind the calm eyes and practiced smile, his health told a story of deep transformation, one that began the moment he was cut away from his future. To understand the health of a palace eunuch is to understand the consequences of profound physical alteration. The procedure itself was only the beginning. In the days following the operation, the child would be monitored closely, first for the person who performed the castration and later by court officials. A eunuch's eligibility for palace service depended on whether he healed properly. If he urinated within a day or two, he was more likely to survive. If he could not, he might die of infection or rupture. Those who lived were sent to convalesce, often under the supervision of elder eunuchs who understood the pain but offered little comfort. Crying was discouraged. Complaints were ignored. The palace had no room for weakness. As the boy grew, the long-term effects of his condition became increasingly evident. Without testes, his body lacked testosterone, and this absence shaped him in subtle and not so subtle ways. His bones grew long and thin, but they lacked density. He developed a soft face, sometimes even feminine in appearance, and a voice that never deepened. While he did not experience puberty like other boys, he still aged, but differently. Many eunuchs gained weight easily, especially around the abdomen and chest. Others remained thin and wiry, but developed chronic fatigue. Some struggled with brittle bones or curved spines. Their bodies were quiet, slow, and unnatural. Medical knowledge in imperial China was advanced in some ways, but the health of eunuchs remained a mystery, even to court physicians. One particularly misunderstood issue was eunuch longevity. Some eunuchs, surprisingly, lived much longer than their peers. Eunuchs also faced unique medical conditions related to their castration. One common ailment was urinary retention or difficulty. Mental health, though not formally recognized, was another burden. And yet, for all these hardships, some eunuchs found stability in the court. Still, old age came for all. And in old age, the body that had been altered so early often failed slowly, painfully. In rare cases, eunuchs who had served with distinction were buried with elaborate rites. The health and longevity of eunuchs in ancient China were not merely questions of medicine. From the moment you rise in the pre-dawn stillness of the imperial palace, your day begins not as your own, but in complete service to the court. As a palace eunuch in ancient China, your life revolves around duty meticulously ordered, intensely scrutinized. The orders are precise. You might be assigned to oversee the lighting of lanterns in the hall of mental cultivation, or to assist in the morning dressing ritual of a prince. Or perhaps you are to serve in the inner quarters of the empress, standing perfectly still in corners, ready to step forward the moment a command is issued. The day is not yours to shape. It is shaped for you by hierarchy, ritual, and an unbending expectation of obedience. You may be asked to organize festivals, coordinate religious rituals, or monitor the sleeping arrangements of concubines, ensuring none break the strict codes of propriety. In time, your experience and loyalty might promote you to roles where you train new eunuchs, teaching them the delicate art of surviving within this gilded prison of etiquette and control. And bound to the rhythms of an institution that sees you not as an individual, but as an extension of its will. You help dress him, wake him, deliver his meals, assist in private rituals, and record his spoken words if dictated. If a ceremony is planned, You rehearse your part beforehand and execute it flawlessly. Even then, your work is not done. You check the outer gates of the palace, lock the stores, extinguish candles. No one will ask how your day was. There are no letters from family, no spouse waiting, no child to tell bedtime stories to. You dream only of service done well, of a day without error, of continuing to exist within the palace walls. Because here, perfection is survival. And survival, for a eunuch, is everything. Only the quiet breathing of other eunuchs surrounds you. Others like you, cut off from the world, tethered forever to the palace. You drift to sleep knowing that in just a few hours, you will rise again and do it all over silently, precisely, faithfully, and ensure that every item is where it belongs. Before you sleep, you report to your superior, bowing once more and confirming that all duties have been fulfilled. If they are not, your rest will be delayed or denied. If a noble visitor misbehaves, it is you who must handle the aftermath discreetly. You bow, always bow. You never meet their eyes. But inside, you feel the distance between their lives and yours, a chasm that grows wider every day. You manage his chamber and sometimes help decide who among the concubines will receive his attention that evening. You may overhear conversations that would end another man's life if repeated. You witness imperial arguments, private sorrow, the emperor's moments of doubt, and the empress's moments of fury. You must forget all of it. You are present, yet invisible. This trust, this obligation to silence, is what keeps you alive, and sometimes what crushes you from within. You carry burdens no one sees. You remember things no one will ask you about. And yet, the weight of what you know never leaves you. These decisions, while small in appearance, often carry political weight, so much so that some eunuchs become pawns in the power games of the court. Or worse, manipulators themselves. But even for those without power, the job requires unshakable memory, discretion, and physical endurance. A slip of the tongue, a forgotten scroll, a mispronounced ritual line, all can mean humiliation or expulsion. You might carry scrolls from the library to the emperor's study, serve food in ritual silence to the court, or oversee the conduct of lower-ranked servants. Meals, if any are provided for the day, are plain. A bowl of rice, perhaps a few pickled vegetables. You must finish quickly, for your schedule resumes within moments. Even if your stomach remains empty, you don't complain. A eunuch does not speak of discomfort. You remain at attention for hours, your hands folded, your eyes cast down. No matter the season, boiling summers or freezing winters, you endure in silence. There are no breaks. There is no one to cover your shift. The palace never sleeps, and therefore neither do you. In an age without phones or modern messengers, eunuchs are the conduits through which orders pass between the emperor and his ministers, or between the empress and her household. You deliver scrolls sealed with wax, always aware that any delay or mishandling could cost you your position or worse. The trust placed in you is absolute and yet fragile. A single misstep, a rumor of disloyalty, or the perception of overstepping your role could result in punishment, disgrace, or exile from the court. Many eunuchs live with a constant sense of caution, never speaking unless spoken to, never moving too quickly, and never revealing emotion. Some eunuchs spend their entire day in one of the many kitchens, supervising preparations for the ceremonial meals that must be served at exact times and with flawless execution. Others are responsible for the laundering of royal garments, ensuring each robe is pressed, folded, and placed with absolute precision. Nothing in the palace is done casually. There is no improvisation. There is only routine, perfection, and the eyes of your superiors always watching. Every action is prescribed. Every moment has a protocol. You move quietly down stone corridors, dressed in neat but modest robes, your presence barely noticed by the aristocracy you serve, yet essential to the operation of the entire palace. You begin by receiving the day's instructions from a superior eunuch, who may have direct communication with one of the inner court officials or even with the emperor's chamberlain. The variety of tasks you may be called upon to perform is astonishing. One of your key roles may be to manage communication. Despite your position being rooted in servitude, the depth of your responsibilities is immense. Some eunuchs oversee entire palace departments, gardens, kitchens, treasury stores, archives. For those assigned to the emperor himself, duties become even more intimate and confidential. You do not eat when you are hungry. You eat when allowed. In some positions, you serve as a guardian of secrets. When guests from outside the palace are received, it is you who ensures they are greeted, led to their appropriate quarters, and supplied with necessities. As evening falls, your tasks shift. You might prepare the royal sleeping chambers, light incense, deliver scrolls for late-night reading, or bring tea to weary ministers. In the darkness of your shared quarters, if you're lucky enough to have them, you lay down on a straw mat and let exhaustion claim you. And as you dream, if you dream at all, you do not dream of escape. You never chose the clothes you wear, not truly. In the palace, everything, even the way fabric drapes over your shoulders, is a statement of rank, role, and proximity to power. As a eunuch in the imperial court of ancient China, you quickly learn that appearance is more than decoration. It is survival. It is protocol. It is how you are seen, ranked, obeyed, or ignored. Each morning, before you even speak, you dress. The robes you wear are not stitched for comfort, nor for self-expression. Black or navy for most. Embroidered or colored only for those who serve in intimate quarters, such as the emperor's chamber or the empress's dressing room. Some eunuchs wear a thin rope belt with attached pouches containing incense tablets, wax seals, or grooming tools for the emperor. These items are not merely functional. They are visible symbols of your trustworthiness and service. Your skin, often pale from years indoors, is kept clean. Some eunuchs dust their faces lightly with rice powder to absorb sweat or apply herbal balms to avoid blemishes. A slightly better quality fabric acquired through connections. A more flattering cut allowed by your tailor in exchange for a favor. Your robes may be searched for hidden jewelry. Your access to the emperor may be questioned. The court forgets those who do not mark themselves with subtle presence. If you remain too plain, you may be overlooked for promotion. Your skills may go unrecognized. When imperial family members travel incognito, you accompany them dressed as a scholar or merchant, robes chosen to blend into the towns they pass through. It is kept in assigned closets, categorized by season, rank, and function. Palace wardrobe officials issue and collect robes with precision. Everything is logged. A stain, a tear, a missing sash, these must be explained. Tailors in the palace work daily to repair, adjust, and clean your garments. You do not thank them. They do their duty, as you do yours. The silk may shine, the brocade may gleam, but the emptiness remains just beneath the surface, stitched silently into every seam. In these moments, your presentation is no longer about palace decorum, but about illusion. You become someone else. A cotton robe with a stitched border. A cap embroidered with your family name, if you remember it. You do not wear these in the presence of nobility, but in the quiet of the night, when the palace lights are dim and the halls fall silent. You may slip into them and remember faintly the feeling of dressing for yourself, not for the emperor, not for duty, but for comfort. And yet, underneath, you remain the eunuch, ever obedient, ever watching, ever prepared. You wake, dress, serve, undress, and repeat. Your reflection in the polished bronze mirror no longer surprises you. You have become part of the machinery, an ornament of the dynasty, a quiet pillar holding up a gilded world. The key, as you learn, is to master balance, to appear polished but never proud, devoted but not desperate, elegant but entirely in the service of others. Whispered rumors could grow. He wears silk as if he were nobility, or he powders his skin too brightly, like a concubine. These whispers kill. Not quickly, but slowly like a poison. It seeps through a reputation until it collapses. A subtle tint of dye that deepens the color of your robe just enough to be noticed by someone important. You learn in time how to blend in without fading completely. The emperor's image is only as divine as the perfection of those who surround him. If his eunuchs look disheveled, if their robes are wrinkled or faded, the illusion of celestial order begins to crack. So your very body becomes a tool in this performance, an ornament that upholds the grandeur of the dynasty. How to be noticed by the right eyes, never by the wrong ones. Though you are not permitted the makeup of noble women, you are also not allowed to appear unkempt. Cleanliness is a moral value in the palace. It reflects inner discipline, loyalty, and respect for the court. A eunuch who tends to ritual ceremonies may wear elevated salls to add a sense of height and presence, never ostentatious, but commanding enough to support the weight of the moment. The silk is coarse, and your sash is functional rather than ornamental. There is no embroidery, no fine threads. Your robes may become softer, lined with finer silk or light brocade. These are not worn for beauty. They are badges of access. They whisper, "I have stood close to the Son of Heaven. I have heard his voice. I have handed him his robes with steady hands." A new sash, perhaps crimson or dark jade, may be granted, signaling your service to a higher-ranking official, or your proximity to one of the inner chambers. The lines of your garments remain modest, but now a pattern may appear in the weave. Dragons, clouds, or the auspicious waves and mountains that reflect loyalty and steadfastness. If you are to participate in a procession perhaps during the emperor, birthday, or a seasonal sacrifice, you wear a formal robe with wide sleeves and stiffer collars, designed to emphasize order and symmetry. You walk slowly, in rhythm with drums or flutes, your face expressionless. No earrings, no perfume, no fanfare, only silent dignity. You do not design these patterns. They are decided by the Office of Wardrobe and ranked according to strict imperial codes. And yet, you feel a quiet pride the first time your sleeve catches the candlelight and glimmers with golden threads. Your job at this stage is not to stand out, but to disappear, to move through corridors like a shadow that never breaks the flow of palace life. They are selected for you, designed to reflect your position in the hierarchy of thousands. The court is not a place of bright individuality for someone like you. It is a place of precision, of silent codes, of calculated presentation. And you are expected to embody this from head to toe. If you are newly inducted, your garments are simple, a plain robe in muted tones grace, faded browns, or modest blues dyed just deeply enough to be clean and dignified, but never rich or luxurious. But should you rise in rank, your appearance begins to change. Slowly, subtly, your head is always shaved. No hair must remain, no trace of a man's topknot or vanity. This is symbolic as much as practical. It separates you from the men of the outer world, from generals and scholars and merchants. The smoothness of your scalp marks you as palace-born, loyal, and altered. Some eunuchs apply scented oils to the scalp, a small luxury permitted in the higher ranks, while others leave it plain and clean, an unspoken sign of humility. Footwear, too, matters. You wear cloth shoes with soft soles that do not echo in the marble corridors. Accessories are carefully regulated. You may carry a scroll case or a ceremonial baton if your role involves announcements or record-keeping. Jewelry is forbidden to lower eunuchs, but higher-ranking ones, especially those serving the emperor, directly may be granted rings of jade or hairpins, carved from ivory or sandalwood. Facial grooming is essential. You have no beard castration, ensured that your body would never produce the hair of a grown man. During ceremonial occasions, your appearance must match the scale of the event. But even within strict boundaries, you learn to shape your image carefully. Standing out can be dangerous. If your appearance suggests ambition or extravagance, you may be targeted by jealous peers or cautious superiors. And yet, anonymity has its own cost. You also come to realize that your appearance is part of a larger theater. On certain occasions, you may be asked to disguise your role entirely. Your wardrobe is not stored in your room, of course. In your private quarters, you may own one or two garments of your own, perhaps gifted during a festival or crafted in quiet moments. These are simple, yet even that indulgence fades. Over time, your body and the palace become indistinguishable. The robes are no longer garments, they are your skin. And though you are dressed each day with care, though your robes carry the dignity of centuries of tradition, you know there is no costume that can hide what was taken from you. In the heart of the Forbidden City, where the walls towered high and the gates rarely opened to the outside world, a different kind of war was always underway, quiet, calculated, and drenched in formality. You could not inherit wealth, marry, or pass on a name, but climb a few rungs, and you could find yourself organizing imperial banquets, guarding the emperor's most intimate chambers, or overseeing entire household departments. It was at these heights that the battles truly began. A careless word overheard could cost someone a promotion. A forged letter or manipulated report could mean exile. You might ally with another eunuch to bring down a mutual rival, only to find your partner turning on you weeks later. Sometimes, bitter enmities lasted for years, with each side slowly bleeding the other through court gossip, falsified accusations, or political sabotage. In such a delicate ecosystem, knowledge was power, and secrets were currency. If you were clever, quiet, and patient, you could destroy a rival without raising a hand. You had to learn to read the slightest twitch of his brow, the sharpness of his breath, the tone of his voice. If a rival impressed him more than you, your position could evaporate overnight. The pressure to remain ever useful and ever pleasing was suffocating. Some eunuchs responded by becoming sycophants, lavishing flattery and bending over backward to satisfy royal whims. Others played long games, feeding the emperor partial truths, manipulating rivalries to maintain their footing. Your only legacy was influence, and that meant you had to climb. But every step upward brought you closer to those already looking to pull you down. Rivalries were not only between eunuchs and other eunuchs, but also between you and court officials, empresses, concubines, and even guards. Each had something to protect access, favor, secrets, and you, a man with nothing left to lose, were both a threat and a tool. The life of a palace eunuch was shaped not just by service to the emperor, but also by the endless struggle for survival and relevance within a fiercely competitive hierarchy. Power was scarce, and ambition was everywhere. There were no battlefields, no swords drawn in rage, just whispers. Maneuvering, subtle gestures, and poisoned words passed in the shadows of silk-draped halls. As a eunuch, you lived and breathed court politics. The hierarchy among eunuchs was rigid but fluid. Those at the bottom might tend to kitchens, clean garments, or serve tea with bowed heads. Sometimes, a eunuch's success bred dangerous envy. Those who became too powerful, like Wei Zhongshan of the Ming dynasty, often attracted hatred from Confucian scholars. And ministers, who viewed eunuchs as base and unworthy of authority. But such men learned how to protect themselves through alliances. You might forge a connection with an influential concubine, or win the emperor's affection through devoted service. In doing so, you became more than just a servant. You became indispensable. And yet, the higher you rose, the more precarious your position. A single misstep, a rumor of disloyalty, or a new favorite in the palace could unravel your entire career. Among eunuchs themselves, friendships were often strategic. Trust was rare, but temporary pacts were essential. The emperor's moods, too, could shift like the wind. You had to learn to read the slightest twitch of his brow, the sharpness of his breath, the tone of his voice. If a rival impressed him more than you, your position could evaporate overnight. The pressure to remain ever useful and ever pleasing was suffocating. Some eunuchs responded by becoming sycophants, lavishing flattery and bending over backward to satisfy royal whims. Others played long games, feeding the emperor partial truths, manipulating rivalries to maintain their footing. Throughout Chinese history, eunuchs have held a paradoxical place in society. While they were often stigmatized and marginalized outside the palace walls, inside the imperial court, some rose to extraordinary power, influence, and notoriety. Zhao Gao's name is synonymous with cunning manipulation. Originally a minor palace official, he gradually amassed influence by controlling access to the young Emperor Qin Shi. They were entrusted with military commands, held political offices, and sometimes even led armies. One famous Tang eunuch, Gao Lishi, stands out as a figure of immense respect and influence. This era saw eunuchs reach unprecedented heights of power, sometimes eclipsing even high-ranking officials. Zheng He, born into a Muslim family, was castrated as a boy and brought into the palace, where he rose to become an admiral and diplomat. He led 7 major naval expeditions into the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as the eastern coast of Africa. Zheng He's voyages demonstrated not only the military and maritime capabilities of Ming China, but also its ambitions for diplomacy and cultural exchange. For example, eunuchs funded the construction and maintenance of temples, commissioned paintings, and supported scholars. Their presence in religious institutions was significant, as many served as caretakers or administrators in Buddhist and Taoist temples. Their unique position has made them fascinating subjects for stories about power, betrayal, and loyalty. From classic Chinese dramas to modern novels, the figure of the eunuch remains a powerful symbol of sacrifice in the complexities of court life. His legacy remains celebrated for its demonstration of Chinese naval prowess and international engagement, a stark contrast to the often negative portrayals of eunuchs. Some, like Zhao Gao and Wei Zhongshan, are remembered for their manipulations and corruption, while others like Gao Lishi and Zheng He are admired for their loyalty and achievements. Their stories reveal the ambiguous space eunuchs occupied simultaneously insiders and outsiders, servants and power brokers. Through their actions, eunuchs left a lasting imprint on Chinese history, demonstrating how personal sacrifice could translate into immense political influence. Their inability to have families meant they lacked traditional lineage and status, causing many to be viewed as incomplete or untrustworthy. This social stigma persisted, even as some achieved remarkable success. One of the most notorious Ming eunuchs was Wei Zhongshan, who controlled the court during the reign of the Tianqi Emperor. Wei Zhongshan's rise from a lowly servant to the de facto ruler of the empire epitomizes both the potential and the peril of eunuch influence. They were often gatekeepers to the emperor, controlling access and information, which gave them tremendous leverage in court intrigues. Their ability to mediate between the emperor and officials made them indispensable, but also subjects of suspicion and resentment. He filled key government positions with loyal followers, manipulated the young emperor, and eliminated rivals through secret police tactics. His reign of terror has been condemned in history, but it also reflects the vacuum of power eunuchs could fill when emperors were weak or uninterested. Gao served Emperor Xuanzong and was known not only for his administrative skills, but also for his loyalty. He acted as a bridge between the emperor and the sprawling bureaucracy, helping maintain stability during a time when eunuchs often drew criticism for corruption. One such eunuch was An the Hai, who served Empress Dowager Cixi, one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. And the Hai was her trusted attendant and wielded considerable influence, which eventually led to his execution when court factions moved against him. His story illustrates the precariousness of eunuch power, even in the twilight years of imperial China. Gao Lixi's reputation as a capable and trusted advisor contrasts sharply with the stereotype of eunuchs as mere schemers. His infamous acts of treachery, such as orchestrating purges and fabricating plots, highlight the immense power a eunuch could wield, often in secret. Yet even then, some eunuchs gained significant authority through their close relationships with emperors. One such eunuch was Liang Shicheng, who served Emperor Hezong. Known for his diplomatic skills and cultural refinement, Liang was involved in managing court ceremonies and was a patron of the arts. His life reflects a less combative and more cultured side of eunuch service. Though his legacy is largely negative, Zhao Gao exemplifies the capacity eunuchs had to alter the fate of empires. Their stories weave through dynasties, revealing moments of loyalty, ambition, corruption, and lasting impact. Understanding the lives of famous eunuchs provides a window into how these men, stripped of traditional family ties but endowed with unique access, could shape politics, culture, and history in profound ways. One of the earliest and most legendary eunuchs was Zhao Gao of the Qin dynasty, who played a pivotal role in the downfall of the dynasty itself. Moving forward in time, during the Tang dynasty, eunuchs became even more prominent. The Song dynasty saw eunuchs continue to play important roles, but with more constraints imposed by Confucian officials who sought to limit their power. Perhaps the most famous and infamous period for eunuchs came during the Ming dynasty. In contrast to Wei Zhongxian's dark legacy, another Ming eunuch, Zheng He, left an indelible mark on both Chinese history and world exploration. The Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, also had notable eunuchs, though their power was more limited than in earlier periods. Beyond individual names, the role eunuchs played in Chinese history cannot be understated. Their influence extended beyond politics. Some eunuchs were patrons of architecture, arts, and religion. Despite their prominence, eunuchs often faced social ostracism and scorn outside the palace. In literature and folklore, eunuchs have been portrayed both as villains and heroes. In summary, famous eunuchs in Chinese history were far from a monolithic group. Castration, the defining and most transformative experience for those who became eunuchs, was a complex and often harrowing process in ancient China. While it was the physical alteration that set eunuchs apart, the procedure itself and the myths and cultural meanings surrounding it held deep social, political, and spiritual significance. Boys and men who underwent castration did so for various reasons, some voluntarily, often in hope of securing a position of influence within the imperial court, while others were forced into it, especially in cases of punishment or as captives. And the penis, known as emasculation, which was considered a complete castration. This method was the most prevalent for palace eunuchs, as it ensured total loss of reproductive capability. The skill of the castrator was crucial. The faster and more precise the cut, the better the chance of survival. The severed parts were often cauterized with hot metal or herbal mixtures to stop bleeding and reduce infection, though many still succumbed to complications. The survivor was then subjected to a prolonged recovery period, often in isolation, where attendants cared for the wounds, and the eunuch began the physical and psychological adjustment to his new condition. In such cases, it was intended to humiliate, weaken, and remove the individual's social standing. However, ironically, some men castrated under duress managed to turn their new status into a position of considerable power within the palace, using their unique access and roles to influence politics. Eunuchs were often depicted as tragic figures, villains, or mysterious outsiders in stories, reflecting popular attitudes and anxieties about their ambiguous position. These portrayals sometimes exaggerated the physical and emotional consequences of castration, but also highlighted the unique social role eunuchs played. And thus the individual was deemed safe to serve in close proximity to the royal family without posing any sexual threat. The trauma of losing one's sexual organs, combined with the social isolation of palace life, shaped eunuchs' identities in complex ways. Some eunuchs struggled with feelings of loss, anger, or alienation, while others adapted and thrived in their new roles, finding purpose in their service. One persistent myth was that castration would completely rob men of their masculinity, rendering them weak or less intelligent. It was viewed as both a sacrifice and a form of devotion, giving up one's masculinity and potential for progeny in exchange for access to imperial power and prestige. The methods, myths, and meanings attached to castration reveal not only the harsh realities faced by eunuchs, but also the deep cultural and political dynamics of Chinese imperial society. Understanding this process helps illuminate the extraordinary sacrifices and complex identities of palace eunuchs, who navigated a world unlike any other in history. Taoist beliefs, with their focus on balance and the flow of life energy, sometimes portrayed eunuchs as having altered life forces. Some Taoist sects even saw castration as a method to control sexual desire and increase spiritual purity. Confucian ideals, on the other hand, were more ambivalent, valuing family continuation and traditional masculinity, yet acknowledging the political necessity of eunuchs. Thus, eunuchs occupied a contradictory place within the moral and cultural frameworks of their society. Many eunuchs accepted or even embraced this trade-off, seeing their new identity as a form of spiritual service to the emperor and the state. In some ways, castration separated them from ordinary men, placing them in a liminal space where they were neither fully male nor female, but something distinct, servants of the divine order embodied by the emperor. In reality, eunuchs were often highly capable and sometimes held significant power, contradicting the stereotype of them as feeble or foolish. Another myth suggested that castration granted eunuchs special powers, such as an extended lifespan or immunity to certain diseases, likely arising from their exclusion from traditional familial and sexual roles. Other forms, which involved only partial castration, removing just the testicles or even just damaging the reproductive function, also existed but were less typical for palace service. The procedure's timing, method, and aftermath varied widely depending on the era, location, and social status of the individual. Understanding how castration was performed, the beliefs attached to it, and how it was perceived reveals much about the lives and identities of palace eunuchs, as well as broader Chinese attitudes toward the body, masculinity, and power. In the context of ancient China, castration was not merely a medical or surgical procedure. It was a rite of passage that marked a man's permanent transition into a new social and political role. Often performed by specialized practitioners called castrators, the procedure involved using knives, scissors, or specially designed blades to cut away the genitalia. The individual undergoing castration had to endure intense pain, and the risk of infection or death was very high. Anesthesia, as we understand it today, did not exist. Sometimes alcohol or herbal sedatives were used, but many eunuchs recounted that the ordeal was excruciating and terrifying. Historically, several methods of castration were used. The most common procedure involved the removal of both the testicles. The actual process was brutal, carried out with crude tools and under primitive medical knowledge. One of the most common methods involved binding the boy or man tightly, then swiftly removing the genitalia. Castration was surrounded by many myths and misconceptions, some fueled by fear, others by superstition. Culturally, the act of castration carried a complex symbolism. There were also strong religious and philosophical undertones to castration. The process of castration was also used as a punishment for criminals or political enemies. Beyond the physical and symbolic aspects, castration had profound psychological effects on those who underwent it. The cultural fascination with castration extended into literature, theater, and art. In summary, castration in ancient China was a physically brutal and culturally loaded act that marked the transformation of boys and men into eunuchs figures who were both indispensable to and isolated from imperial power. Eunuchs occupied a unique and often paradoxical place within the religious and spiritual life of ancient Chinese imperial courts. Far from being mere servants or political functionaries, many eunuchs held significant religious responsibilities and played critical roles in the performance of rituals, management of temples, and the broader spiritual landscape of the palace. Eunuchs often acted as custodians or stewards of these sacred places, ensuring that rituals were performed correctly and that the spaces remained pure and orderly. Because they could not produce heirs and were physically and socially distinct from ordinary men, eunuchs were seen as less likely to engage in the power struggles and family rivalries that could compromise ritual purity. These events were grand affairs, often involving music, dance, and precise choreography, reflecting the Confucian emphasis on order and propriety. Their close proximity to the throne and trusted position allowed them to convey prayers, consult diviners or monks, and interpret omens or portents. Many eunuchs adopted personal devotional practices, embracing Buddhism, Taoism, or folk religions as sources of comfort and meaning in their often lonely and difficult lives. Monasteries and temples could serve as places of refuge or retirement for eunuchs who had served the palace for decades. Taoist rituals, alchemy, and immortality practices appealed to many eunuchs, who sought ways to transcend their physical limitations and achieve spiritual purity. They were often involved in rituals to ensure good fortune, protect the palace from evil spirits, or promote health and longevity for the emperor. These practices, while less formalized than Confucian rites, were deeply ingrained in the culture and helped create a rich tapestry of spiritual life within the court. Some eunuchs became adept at Taoist ceremonies, using their knowledge to enhance their status or provide spiritual services within the palace. Their unique combination of servitude, power, and religious function made them unforgettable figures in the cultural memory of China. Their ability to mediate between the emperor and religious authorities gave them leverage in palace intrigues. This intertwining of spiritual and political power sometimes made eunuchs targets of suspicion or resentment, but also underscored their indispensable position. Some eunuchs even became patrons of religious institutions, sponsoring temple construction or commissioning religious texts, thereby shaping the spiritual landscape of their time. In some cases, eunuchs were responsible for arranging visits by religious figures, Buddhist monks, Taoist priests, or shamans, and overseeing their activities within the palace grounds. Many eunuchs were devout Buddhists, supporting monasteries and participating in meditation and prayer. Confucian scholars and officials sometimes viewed eunuchs with disdain, questioning their moral integrity and suitability for sacred duties. Tensions could arise when eunuchs' political ambitions clashed with the interests of religious institutions, or when their influence threatened established hierarchies. As custodians of temples, participants in sacred ceremonies, spiritual advisors, and religious patrons, eunuchs bridged the realms of the mundane and the divine. Their service helped sustain the legitimacy of imperial rule and enriched the cultural and religious heritage of ancient China. Far from being mere attendants, eunuchs were vital actors in the religious world of the palace, navigating a complex web of faith, power, and identity. The Buddhist ideals of detachment, compassion, and spiritual liberation resonated with eunuchs' own experiences of renunciation and social marginalization. Their patronage helped Buddhism flourish in imperial China, influencing art, literature, and religious thought. Their mediation helped maintain the delicate balance between the imperial court as worldly power and its sacred legitimacy. Eunuchs' roles could include organizing participants, managing offerings, and even serving as ritual attendants to the emperor and empress during these solemn occasions. Their celibate status resonated with religious ideals of chastity and spiritual discipline, making them fitting intermediaries in sacred ceremonies. Their roles could range from practical tasks such as cleaning altars, preparing offerings, and coordinating schedules to more ceremonial duties such as leading prayers or participating in ritual processions. Their distinct status set apart by physical alteration, social isolation, and intimate access to the emperor enabled them to bridge the worldly and the divine in ways that few others could. Religion in ancient China was not a private affair, but a deeply integrated aspect of governance and social order. The emperor was regarded as the Son of Heaven, a mediator between the celestial and earthly realms, responsible for maintaining harmony and balance. Rituals, ceremonies, and religious observances were crucial in reinforcing imperial authority and legitimizing rule. Eunuchs, as trusted palace officials, were often charged with assisting in these sacred functions, managing religious spaces and overseeing the intricate logistics of worship. Within the imperial palace, temples and shrines dedicated to various deities, ancestors, and cosmological forces were maintained with great care. One reason eunuchs were trusted with these religious responsibilities was their perceived neutrality. Eunuchs were frequently involved in the elaborate court rituals that marked the Chinese calendar, including seasonal festivals, rites for ancestors, and imperial sacrifices. Moreover, eunuchs sometimes acted as spiritual advisors or intermediaries for the emperor. The involvement of eunuchs in religious life extended beyond formal rituals. Buddhism, in particular, found significant patronage from eunuchs during various dynasties. Taoism also played a vital role in the spiritual lives of eunuchs. In addition to major religions, eunuchs participated in popular folk beliefs and local cults. The religious roles of eunuchs also had political implications. By controlling access to sacred spaces and rituals, eunuchs could influence court politics and power dynamics. Despite their involvement in religion, eunuchs often faced ambivalence or hostility from religious elites. Nevertheless, eunuchs persisted as key religious actors, shaping imperial rituals and contributing to the spiritual fabric of Chinese history. In conclusion, the role of eunuchs in religion and spiritual life within the palace was multifaceted and profound. The eunuch system, which had existed for centuries as an integral part of Chinese imperial governance and palace life, faced a gradual but definitive decline that culminated in its abolition in the early 20th century. This ending was not sudden, but the result of profound political, social, and cultural transformations that swept China as it moved from imperial rule into the modern era. Understanding the demise of the eunuchs requires examining both the internal dynamics of the imperial court and the broader historical forces that reshaped Chinese society. These upheavals exposed the weaknesses of the imperial state and accelerated demands for modernization and reform. The overthrow of the imperial regime fundamentally altered the political landscape. The self-strengthening movement, and later the 100 Days Reform, aimed to modernize the military, education, and government institutions, often targeting traditional elements viewed as obstacles. Eunuchs, with their deep-rooted privileges and resistance to change, became a target of criticism. Some reformers blamed eunuchs for weakening the dynasty through corruption and manipulation, making them scapegoats for broader systemic failures. After the Qing dynasty's fall, the Forbidden City was turned into a museum, and the centuries-old court life, with its attendant rituals and personnel, was dismantled. The vast bureaucracy of eunuchs, once numbering in the hundreds, was disbanded. This marked the end of an era where eunuchs had been central players in Chinese political and social life. As imperial rule crumbled under internal and external pressures, the institutions and individuals tied to that order, including the eunuchs, were swept aside. The abolition of the eunuch system symbolized both the loss of an ancient tradition and the painful birth of a new China, striving to modernize and redefine itself. Your support helps keep this channel going and allows us to bring you more immersive, well-researched content about intriguing lives from the past. The eunuchs, once powerful and feared, faded into history, leaving behind a complex legacy intertwined with the rise and fall of one of the world's longest-lasting empires. And if you have any topics you want me to cover next, just let me know. Without an emperor, the need for palace eunuchs vanished. From their painful beginnings and strict training to their influential roles within the imperial court and ultimately their decline as China modernized, they uncovered the many layers behind a life few ever truly understood. The story of eunuchs is not just one of power and politics, but also of isolation, resilience, and survival in a world that demanded sacrifice and secrecy. Their stories, experiences, and the institution they embodied became subjects of historical study and popular fascination. Their influence on Chinese architecture, administration, and culture persisted. The palaces, temples, and artworks they had helped create remained, as did the complex political and social patterns shaped by their centuries-long presence. Modern historians and scholars continued to study eunuchs to understand better the intricacies of imperial China, the nature of power, and the human cost of historical change. The disappearance of eunuchs was symbolic of China's transformation from a traditional empire to a modern nation-state, struggling to reconcile its past with the demands of the future. The new Republican government sought to dismantle many institutions associated with imperial rule, including the eunuch system. Although some former eunuchs remained in service or adapted to new roles, their status as palace officials was effectively ended. The presence of eunuchs, relics of an older and increasingly obsolete court culture, became an anachronism in a China struggling to catch up with Western powers. Reformers and revolutionaries saw eunuchs as symbols of corruption, decadence, and backwardness, elements that needed to be swept away to build a new, modern nation. Without the emperor's direct patronage, eunuchs lost their official functions and privileges. Many struggled to find a place in a rapidly changing society. Some turned to menial work or lived in poverty, while others integrated into local communities or even fled to the countryside. For much of imperial China's history, eunuchs had been indispensable to the functioning of the palace. The traditional respect and fear they commanded within the palace gave way to disdain and mockery in popular culture. Eunuchs were often portrayed in literature and theater as tragic or comical figures, emphasizing their emasculation and outsider status. This reflected a broader cultural movement toward modern gender norms and social roles, where the physical and social condition of eunuchs was increasingly stigmatized. Their unique status allowed them intimate access to the emperor and his family, granting them considerable political influence. The Qing court retained eunuchs, but their numbers and influence had diminished compared to earlier eras, such as the Ming dynasty, when eunuchs like Wei Zhongshan had notoriously dominated court politics. The Qing emperors were generally wary of eunuch power, and reforms sought to limit their roles. Moreover, the entire imperial system was under pressure from internal rebellion, external imperialist aggression, and rapid social change. At times, eunuchs wielded enormous power, effectively controlling palace affairs, influencing succession, and even shaping national policy. However, their position was always precarious, tied to the fortunes of the dynasty and the personality of the reigning emperor. Their closeness to power also bred resentment and suspicion from scholar officials and other court factions, who viewed eunuchs as corrupt, manipulative, and a threat to the Confucian order. By the late Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, the eunuch system was already in decline. The 19th century was a period of crisis for China, marked by the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and growing foreign incursions. One of the key moments in the decline of the eunuch system came with the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912 and the establishment of the Republic of China. Even before the fall of the dynasty, reform efforts during the late Qing period had attempted to curtail eunuch power. The early Republican period further marginalized eunuchs. The new political elites favored Western-style bureaucracies and military organizations over the old palace structures. Beyond politics, social attitudes towards eunuchs shifted dramatically. The final blow to the eunuch system came with the abolition of the imperial palace itself. Some eunuchs who survived into the 20th century became historical curiosities, relics of a bygone age. However, the legacy of the eunuchs did not vanish entirely. In conclusion, the end of the eunuch era was the result of profound shifts in Chinese society, politics, and culture. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the fascinating and complex world of palace eunuchs in ancient China. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history and want to explore more stories like this, please make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you and discussing history together. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the fascinating stories history has to offer. Take care.